Picture this. It's May 10, 1940, and Winston Churchill has just become Prime Minister of Britain. As he sits in his new office, reading the latest reports from France, the news couldn't be worse. The German war machine that destroyed Poland in 18 days is now ripping through Western Europe like a hurricane. France, the nation that helped win the last war, is collapsing. Belgium has fallen. The Netherlands surrendered in just 5 days. And now, Hitler's eyes are turning toward Britain. Across the English Channel, the most powerful air force in history is preparing to rain death from the skies. The Royal Air Force has fewer than 700 fighter planes to defend the entire British Isles. The German Luftwaffe has over 2,600 aircraft, flown by pilots who've already conquered half of Europe. This is the story of how 3,000 young men, most barely old enough to vote, stood between Nazi Germany and total victory. How Britain's darkest hour became democracy's finest moment. If you've been following the story arc, you've seen how one assassination sparked a world war, how a failed artist became a dictator, and how blitzkrieg shocked the world. Now you're about to witness the battle that determined whether freedom or fascism would rule the world. Because when those first German bombers appeared over British skies, they weren't just attacking an island. They were attacking the last hope of free nations everywhere. The Fall of France. Let me take you back to June 1940 to understand just how desperate Britain's situation had become. The world thought France was invincible. The Maginot Line, that massive chain of fortresses along the German border, was supposed to make invasion impossible. The French army was considered the finest in Europe, with more tanks and artillery than the Germans. But Hitler had learned from our last episode about Poland. Why attack where the enemy expects you? Instead, German panzers swept through the Ardennes forest, a route the French considered impassable for large armies. In just 6 weeks, France, the great military power that had fought Germany to a standstill for 4 years in World War I, surrendered. I often think about that moment when Churchill received the phone call from French Premier Paul Reynaud. "We have been defeated. We are beaten." The Prime Minister who had warned about Hitler for years, who had been ignored and ridiculed, was now facing his worst nightmare coming true. Britain stood alone, not just against Germany, but against a Nazi empire that now stretched from Norway to the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic Ocean to the outskirts of Moscow. The world thought it was over. Even some in Churchill's own government whispered about making peace with Hitler. Hitler himself was surprised by how quickly France had fallen. His generals presented him with Operation Sea Lion, the plan to invade Britain. But there was a problem. The Royal Navy. Britain's fleet was still the most powerful in the world, and no invasion could succeed while British warships controlled the seas. The German solution was brilliant and terrifying. Destroy the Royal Air Force first. Without air cover, the British Navy would be sitting ducks for German dive bombers. Without the RAF, Britain's cities would be defenseless. Without air superiority, Operation Sea Lion could proceed. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised Hitler he could crush the RAF in just 4 days. He had good reason for confidence. The German Air Force had 1,300 bombers, 1,300 fighters, and 400 dive bombers. They had experienced pilots who'd fought in Spain, Poland, and France. They had the most advanced fighter plane in the world, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Britain's defense looked pathetic in comparison. The RAF had just 700 Hurricane and Spitfire fighters. Many of their pilots were barely out of training school. Some had never fired their guns in combat. The world looked at these numbers and saw an inevitable German victory. But Hitler had made a crucial mistake, one that connected directly back to our earlier story arc episodes. Remember how we talked about individual decisions creating massive consequences? Hitler's decision to focus on bombing cities instead of military targets would prove to be as costly as that wrong turn in Sarajevo. The young men who climbed into their Spitfires and Hurricanes that summer knew the odds. Fighter Command had calculated that each pilot had a life expectancy of just 2 weeks in combat. These weren't career soldiers or seasoned veterans. They were university students, shop clerks, farmers' sons, kids who'd learned to fly in peacetime and now found themselves defending civilization itself. I've read the letters they wrote home during those weeks, and what strikes me most is their matter-of-fact courage. They thought they were just doing their jobs, not realizing they were participating in one of history's most crucial battles. August 10, 1940. Eagle Day, the Germans called it. Over 1,400 German aircraft crossed the English Channel in the largest air attack in history. British radar stations, a new technology that gave defenders their only advantage, tracked the massive formations as they approached. Picture the scene. Young RAF pilots, many still teenagers, sitting in dispersal huts at airfields across southern England. The telephone rings. Scramble! In minutes, they're racing across grass runways, climbing into fighters that represent Britain's last hope. At 30,000 feet, British Spitfires dove into formations of German bombers larger than anything ever seen. Hurricane pilots slashed through Stuka dive bombers, the same planes that had terrorized Poland. For the first time since the war began, the German war machine was meeting serious resistance. But the numbers were still terrifying. Day after day, hundreds of German planes crossed the Channel. British pilots flew 4, 5, sometimes 6 missions a day. They landed, refueled, rearmed, and took off again while mechanics repaired bullet holes in their wings. The stories from those weeks read like fiction, but they're all true. Douglas Bader, flying with artificial legs after losing both in a pre-war crash. Adolf Sailor Malin, a South African who became Britain's deadliest pilot. Johnny Johnson, a shy engineer who discovered he was a natural fighter pilot. The Luftwaffe was suffering losses they'd never experienced. In Poland, German pilots had faced outdated fighters flown by under-trained pilots. In Britain, they met Spitfires and Hurricanes flown by men defending their homes. The difference was like night and day. Then came September 7th, 1940, the day Hitler made the decision that may have saved the world. Frustrated by his Air Force's failure to destroy Fighter Command and enraged by a small RAF bombing raid on Berlin, he changed targets. Instead of continuing to attack RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to bomb British cities. London, Coventry, Liverpool, Manchester. Night after night, German bombers rained death on civilian neighborhoods. The world thought Hitler was being even more ruthless, more evil. In reality, he'd just made his greatest strategic blunder. By shifting from military to civilian targets, he gave the RAF time to recover, rebuild, and regroup. The Blitz was horrific for British civilians. Over 40,000 would die in the bombing campaign, but it was also a gift to Fighter Command. While German bombs fell on London's East End, British factories were producing new Spitfires. While civilians sheltered in underground stations, fresh pilots were completing their training. September 15, 1940, now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day, saw the largest air battle in history. Over 1,500 German aircraft crossed the Channel in 2 massive waves. This was Hitler's final attempt to achieve air superiority before launching Operation Sea Lion. But something had changed. British pilots who'd been outnumbered 4-1 in August were now meeting German formations on nearly equal terms. New pilots had joined squadrons. Damaged aircraft had been repaired. The production lines that had been bombed were back in operation. When the day ended, the Luftwaffe had lost 60 aircraft, the RAF just 26. More importantly, the Germans had failed to achieve their objective. British airfields were still operational. Fighter command was still fighting. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain, the operation that was supposed to end the war, had been called off. Let's be clear about what this victory cost. During the Battle of Britain, 544 Royal Air Force pilots died. The average age was just 22 years old. Many never saw their 20th birthday. They gave what Churchill called their all, so that democracy might survive. But their sacrifice achieved something remarkable. For the first time since the war began, Nazi Germany had been stopped. The Wehrmacht war machine that had conquered Poland in 18 days, Norway in 62 days, and France in just 6 weeks, had failed to defeat a small island nation. The psychological impact was enormous. The world had seen that Hitler wasn't invincible, that the German military could be defeated, that resistance was possible. This was the moment when other nations began to believe that fighting back was worth the cost. As we've seen throughout the story arc, individual moments create global consequences. Britain's victory in the air had effects that reached far beyond the English Channel. Stalin, watching from Moscow, decided he could afford to wait before making a deal with Hitler. Roosevelt, observing from Washington, began increasing aid to Britain. Resistance movements across occupied Europe took heart from Britain's example. Most importantly, Britain remained a base for future operations. The airfields that German bombers had failed to destroy would later launch the aircraft that bombed German cities. The ports that Operation Sea Lion never captured would receive American troops for D-Day. What makes the story arc so compelling is how ordinary people rise to extraordinary moments. The Battle of Britain wasn't won by superior technology or better strategy. It was won by individual human beings making impossible choices under unimaginable pressure. I think about the radar operators, mostly young women, who tracked German formations and guided British fighters to intercept them. I think about the ground crews, who worked 18-hour days keeping planes in the air. I think about the civilians who kept working in aircraft factories even while bombs fell around them. Churchill said of the RAF pilots, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." But the truth is, it wasn't just the few who won this battle. It was an entire nation that refused to give up. Standing here, over 80 years later, I think about what the Battle of Britain teaches us about democracy under threat. When institutions are attacked, when freedom is challenged, when the powerful try to intimidate the weak, individual courage still matters. The young men who climbed into Spitfires that summer weren't fighting for abstract political theories. They were fighting for the right to live in a world where people could choose their own leaders, speak their own minds, and build their own futures. That world, our world, exists because 3,000 young pilots decided that some things are worth dying for. Because radar operators stayed at their posts during bombing raids. Because an entire nation chose resistance over surrender. Next week on the story arc, we'll see what happened when Hitler, frustrated by his failure to conquer Britain, made an even more catastrophic decision: to invade the Soviet Union. You'll discover how Operation Barbarossa created the conditions that would ultimately destroy Nazi Germany. Because here's the lesson of Britain's darkest hour. Sometimes the moments when everything seems lost are actually the moments when everything changes. Sometimes the darkest hour really is just before the dawn. The story arc continues, and the tide of war is about to turn.